Welcome to Off the Page, the show where we talk with Colorado authors to get the story behind the story. My name is Stacy McKenzie, a librarian here at Mamie, Doud, Eisenhower Public Library in Broomfield. And today on the show, we're happy to have Daniel Willis, author of Immortal Betrayal. Daniel, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Wonderful to be here.
And bringing your wonderful first book of 5 that you have coming out.
Yes.
First novel, and then this one's going to be one of 5 that you have. Well, let me start off by asking if you are a full-time author or if you have any other careers.
I have another job.
Okay.
I would like it not to be a career. I want writing to be my career. I'm working in that direction. But I also work for the state of Colorado.
Okay, I think a lot of people who are aspiring writers have different careers, so it's always interesting to find out. Now, before we jump into your fantasy novel here, you actually started off writing nonfiction, is that correct?
That's correct. I've been writing nonfiction for almost 20 years, specifically about European royal families.
Oh, European royal families. How did you get started writing on that?
I took an interest in them when I was a teenager. Became fascinated by the Queen and her extended family and how they were all interrelated to other European royal families. I've been a genealogist for as long as I can remember, and the genealogy aspects of those interrelations between the family really caught my interest. And I went from there, and after doing enough research, I realized, you know, I should be getting paid for this, so I wrote some books for it.
Very good. It's wonderful to turn a passion into something you can get paid for. And so, writing for that long, you're considered kind of an expert?
I am. I've also been used several times by the media as a royal expert to cover various royal events.
Oh, wow. That's
most recently, the wedding of the Prince of Monaco.
Oh, wow.
And that was quite fun. I got to go to Monaco and fell in love with the place, and maybe we'll retire there one day when this becomes a bestseller.
Oh, how wonderful. What other events have you covered for local media?
See, I have also covered, well, here local media, we covered Prince Harry's recent trip to Colorado.
Okay, yep, that was
And
exciting.
then I do talk fairly regularly about the upcoming birth in England, that I keep checking my Twitter account every few minutes to see if there's news.
Any minute, any minute.
Yes.
It seems like Americans are kind of obsessed with the royal family. Why is that?
The only thing that seems to make sense to me is because it's simply something we don't have. So we don't really have a local personal frame of reference for the royals. So it's exotic to us, and therefore attracts our attention to it.
When did that all get started? That we became
Well, I think
so
it's gone on
excited?
for as long as we've been a country, because we went to such a effort to kick out the king in the 1700s, and then pretty quickly after that we started looking back to European and going, you know, they're kind of cool. You know, Queen Victoria made royalty kind of cool, if a little stodgy, and then when we get up into the 50s and 60s, and movie and television came along, we had things like Royal Wedding, the movie with Fred Astaire, and it started really glamorizing the concept. And also we have the Duke of Windsor giving up his throne for an American woman.
Yay!
That was
exciting.
That was exciting, although the English may not think it was quite as exciting as the Americans do.
Yes,
But this all led into Americans really taking an interest in it. And a lot of times they take an interest in the maybe not quite so formal side of it, like the American divorcee with the Prince of Wales, that sort of thing.
Yes, yes, that's a little different.
Yes.
So, for 20 years you wrote about the royals, nonfiction, jumping into a novel.
Jumping into a novel.
What made you jump into that?
I've wanted to write fiction for a very long time.
Okay.
I have a kind of long and winding path on my nonfiction writing, starting out with having a publisher that then went out of business, then discovering the world of self-publishing. And so once I got pretty good with the self-publishing concept, then I realized, you know, I really could do this as a fiction writer as well. And for my first novel, I did go to a area I know well. There is, it's not a royal history, but the Romanov family of Russia are primary characters.
Okay.
But they're not part of the primary plot, but they are all around as it goes on. And most of the book does take place in Russia in 2 different time frames.
So we've got a royal element in there. How much do you feel like your research on royals and all the excitement that goes on with them, how much of that helped you write this book?
I think it helped a lot. One of my nonfiction books was Romanovs in the 21st century.
Okay.
So I researched that family quite heavily. I felt like I knew them inside and out, and this book came out part of that research as well.
So Daniel, give me an idea what Immortal Betrayal is about.
The whole concept, the whole series, is about a secondary race of humans called the Mages, which is short for Homo Magus. It's a scientific term they give themselves to differentiate them from Homo sapiens, which they call the sapes.
Okay.
So it kind of sounds like West Side Story with the sharks and the jets here, but we have the sapes and the mages. The mages are human in every sense of the word, except that they age slowly and as a result live very long lives, to the tune of several centuries.
Okay.
So it allows them to witness history in a way that the Homo sapiens don't get to. And the first book is about one particular mage by the name of Dano. He is a half French, half Hungarian mage, starting off his life in his father's homeland of Normandy. A tragedy befalls his village, and he goes eastward to his mother's family in Hungary, and from there on to Russia.
Wow.
And then he just gets involved with history as it's happening. And he's somewhat an observer to history, but in minor ways also a participant. When we get to the 1916 time frame, Rasputin figures into the story very heavily, and he becomes very much involved in the how history transpired there.
And so from the 1400s to 1900s is all in this one first book?
It is. The 1400s is dealt with briefly.
Okay.
It basically sets the stage and gets us started.
Okay.
Most of the plot takes place in 1682.
Okay.
And then the 1916 time frame is the last several chapters.
Wow. And that's just the first book.
And that's just the first book.
How is the story going to progress through all 5 books? You've got the second one done and coming out very soon.
The second was due out in November.
Okay.
And it'll actually take place starting off in Colorado.
Oh, excellent.
So it will have a local angle to it. It'll be in eastern Colorado during the Civil War era.
Okay.
The Sand Creek Massacre will be featured very prominently in the first half of this book, and will be. And we're also getting ready to celebrate the 150th anniversary of that sad event. That comes up next year. Wow. Which I didn't realize when I was writing the book until I did the math finally.
Right.
And then it moves into World War II Germany and takes place largely in German concentration camps. And the theme of the second book is centered very much around the concept of prejudice. And so we will see it both on the Caucasian versus Indian relationships in the Civil War era, and then in the, not so much in with the Jewish concentration camps, but with mages versus sapes in World War II. And the mage versus sape concept is going to continue throughout the series. It's briefly hinted at in the first book, and as each book goes on, it will progress and become more pronounced.
And we're talking about this as a 5-series set, and you've got 2 done. How did you even know it would be 5 books?
I have a general concept of what time frames will be covered and general plot. I have this weird way of writing that I never quite know what's going to happen until I write it.
Okay.
And for the second book that I just finished, I went for the longest time without knowing if the main antagonist was going to live or not until I finally wrote that last chapter. Now I know the answer.
We keep talking about this as a series. First and second ones are done, but you have a series of 5. How do you know, without having written them, without having plotted very much, that you're going to have 5?
Well, at one point, in the early phases of writing the second book, I knew I had other books I wanted to write in addition to this, so I knew I wanted this to not be the only thing I'm doing.
Okay.
So at some point it has to end.
Right.
And I had more to tell than what would fit in a trilogy, and so I started thinking about what length is a reasonable length to tell the entire story I need to tell. 5 books sounded very reasonably once I started thinking about the time frames I wanted to cover and the historical figures I want to have involved.
You've got all sorts of time periods you're talking in this book, 1400s, 1900s. How did you choose those time periods?
The time periods I picked in the second book were because they fit the story. There was great places to talk about prejudices. The first book was because it was a favorite of mine. The Romanovs have always been my favorite royal family to read about and research about and write about. So being able to talk heavily about Peter the Great when he was a young man. Most people know the story of Peter the Great when he was an older man and a father and wife, or a father and husband, and all of this. But he became czar when he was 10. So there's a whole early part of his life that's a fascinating story to tell in its own right.
Okay, that's great. I love that there are more than one time frame to follow in this book. How does the history fit in? Do you feel like your historical accounts are pretty accurate, except maybe where the characters change things?
The way I like to describe them is, these are history books with a few characters your history teacher forgot to tell you about.
Okay. I like that.
I go to great lengths to make the history very realistic.
Okay.
And the section about Rasputin revolves around his murder.
Okay.
And I researched very heavily what happened that night, how it all played down. And another book came out kind of recently before I wrote it about very specifically, minute by minute, detailing what happened that night. And I found it to be a valuable resource.
Oh, wow.
Because this is somebody that went to all the archives and got all the records. I was a Russian writer, and he did a wonderful job with it.
So we can really learn our history from this.
You can.
Okay.
Yeah, if I spell it out in history, it's pretty much the way it happened.
Okay, very good. Okay, Daniel, when we were talking, you categorized yourself as a fantasy author, not so much sci-fi. What's your definition of the difference between those?
Science fiction, in my mind, usually somehow involves a ship that can leave this planet, or travel between other planets, or not involve the Earth at all. Fantasy to me is something that may or may not be on Earth, I don't know, it could be in someplace else, but usually involves some magical element.
Okay.
Or some extension of what we consider normalcy.
Okay.
I consider science fiction to need to have the science there.
Okay.
It needs to have the technology involved.
And where does this definition that you say to me, where does that fall with other authors, or when you look it up in a dictionary? I mean, how blurry is that line between
It's
science
very
fiction?
blurry, and all lines between genres in recent years have become more blurry. There was a time when you could pick up a book and say, it's a horror book, it's a romance, it's a this, it's a that. And in recent, I don't know, 10, 20 years maybe, we have seen quite a bit of blurring there. I mean, if you look at something like the Twilight series, the primary characters are vampires. Automatically, that would have gone into a horror category once upon a time ago, but it's far more romance than horror. And then it's also young adult.
Yes.
So there's that whole category that just runs a whole gambit of things that, wow.
It's sort of limiting, isn't it, when they're labeled like that?
They are, and so this one I think is, the publisher labeled it historical fantasy.
Wow.
So that
Wow.
was that was
Interesting.
the best way to cover it. And then you have this whole concept of urban fantasy. What makes something an urban fantasy versus a traditional fantasy? Although when I think about it, urban fantasy is what I would use to describe a standalone novel that I've been working on, which involves the Greek gods and them coming back to power in the present day.
Oh my.
So
You've been busy.
yes.
When we talk about Immortal Betrayal, let's label it a little more.
Okay.
But from your perspective, who do you think is the best audience for your book?
That's a really hard one to say who's the best audience. It appeals to quite a few. Of course, historical fiction readers are going to be very enjoy this very much, particularly if they're interested in Russian history. Of course, the rest of the series, none of the rest of it will take place in Russia. So that'll be jumping around a location as well as time. So there's a lot of general historical fiction there. But there's also the fantasy element of it. So that appeals to that reader as well. And I attend conferences for both the sci-fi fantasy community and the historical fiction community.
Everybody loves science fiction and fantasy. Why do you think we've latched onto that genre so much?
Well, I think a lot of people read for the basic reason of escapism. And if you have a science fiction and fantasy, that allows really a total departure from everyday life. And it's more escapism that way than if you read, say, a standard like coming of age story for the young adult crowd. You have a standard coming of age story where some teenagers facing typical everyday teenage problems. Well, okay, they mightn't get into that, but that also might be like, okay, that's Susie's story. I know that one already.
Yeah.
Whereas if it's some teenager who has been catapulted off of the earth for whatever reason and they have to figure out how to get home and have all these different clues to follow and this type of thing, then it becomes far more fascinating and much more of a way to get away from your everyday life.
Yep, further and further away from every day.
Yeah.
Now you're working with a very specific publisher, Thursday Night Press. Tell me how you got involved with them.
Well, Thursday Night Press, the principals of the organization are personal friends of mine, so that was how I got to know them. But also and I started off with this book as a self-published book before Thursday Night Press came into being. So they picked it up even though it was an already published, self-published book. They are a local publishing company who is fairly new on the scene, and their primary purpose in existence is to promote local Denver area authors.
Okay.
And that's what they focus on, and they also focus on some fairly specific genre stuff. They pretty much limit themselves at this point, because they are just starting off, to the sci-fi fantasy genre for the most part, although they do a little bit of nonfiction in the LGBT area.
Okay.
One of their books deals a lot with the marriage laws involving same-sex couples across the country and how that's changing.
You have a website.
I do.
Tell us about your website. What can people find when they go to visit there?
My website is danielawillis.com. If you don't put the A in there, you'll find a saxophonist.
Oh.
So my name is fairly common. There are several authors with the name Dan Willis also. So I very specifically put my middle initial in there. Okay. If you go to my website, you will find information about all of my nonfiction books, or at least all the ones that are still in print. You'll find information about these guys coming up. You will also find links to a couple blogs that I do. I do one blog about my experiences in the writing industry, and then I do another one specifically about the Royals. And it's called Royally Speaking is the name of that blog.
You write nonfiction, and then you've got 3 more books to work on in this series. But you mentioned even another standalone novel you're working on?
A standalone novel that I've got about a third of the way written. Wow. It was one that I started while I was floundering around trying to find a publisher for this series. So I got started on it. It's in progress. I kind of know where it's going to go. But it's going to probably wait until I finish the series first. And then I have another trilogy after that that is another genre of historical fiction, alternate history, where you take a point in history, you change it, and you see how the world revolves with that change in place. And in this case, I'm going to make a change dealing with Queen Victoria, and it's going to greatly affect the outcome of the world because it will alter the whole course of the world wars.
Wow. And you know enough about the royals that you'll be able to fill in all those blanks there.
And it will be, and the royal families will be the primary characters of that series. It's a trilogy. So.
With so many projects, how do you keep them organized in your head or physically, or how do you juggle all of that?
Well, most of my friends would tell me there's enough room in there for, to make room for them, but I do have a fairly extensive filing system too on my computer that I put little bits and pieces of things I write here and there, and I kind of have folders for this project and that project and the other project, so I do have some organization in my life, although nobody would really know it to see me.
Well, we have a lot of people that would like to be writers, that are wanting to be writers, but sometimes they have a little bit of a stall or have trouble get going. And I always like to ask writers, authors, what advice would you give to somebody who's a new author? Never
ever give up. Just keep going. Even if you have to self-publish or you want to self-publish, keep writing and keep it coming out. Eventually something will snag.
Okay.
I had a recent conversation with Cherry Priestman, who is now a very famous sci-fi writer. But it wasn't until her 11th book that she became famous.
Okay.
So she was lucky enough to get a publisher early on, but her books were just kind of floundering along and floundering. And then number 11 came out, and she hit.
Bam.
And so I took great inspiration from her in the concept of never giving up.
That's great.
Also, be smart enough to get somebody else to edit your work and get it done professionally.
Okay.
That's one thing that I do see a lot of self-published writers fall down on.
So that's an expense you're going to have to plan for.
That's an expense you're going to have to plan for because it is not cheap. For a standard-sized novel, you can usually expect it to be about $1,000 to $1,500.
Okay.
So that can be a little pricey. And then the other thing is be involved with writer groups. Learn about the trade from what other people have done. Learn from other people's mistakes. Also, with these groups, you'll eventually find out about conventions to go to where you can meet the professionals.
Okay.
Editors and publishers and agents, that kind of thing.
Okay. Daniel, that's great advice. I love it when authors mentions writers group because that seems like such a huge, huge way to bounce your idea off of other people.
And it's also a good way to get, if you, particularly if it's a critique group, somebody who you share the work with as you're writing it, because then you can get feedback on, are you heading in a right direction? Did you go down a rabbit hole? I do belong to a critique group, and one of the other writers has her own kind of concepts about how some things are interesting that nobody else does. So she tends to go off into that little rabbit hole that I talked about. But and so off the critique group, we can tell her, well, it's kind of an interesting concept, but here's how you can make it more interesting to a broader audience. So that you get that kind of feedback, which is just invaluable.
Because really, you want to write for what you want to write, but it is to hopefully sell books a lot of times. It would be nice to do that.
Yes. Basically, if you're going to be a professional writer, I mean, the ultimate goal there is you're going to make money doing it.
Yes.
And that means it has to sell.
That usually means success if you're making money.
Right.
Daniel, thank you so much. I hope that you get all of your stuff done on your list because you have got so much going on, and it's just very exciting to hear how prolific you are and how many different directions you're going.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
So thanks again for being on the show.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Check your local libraries for the books that we've talked about on today's show, and join us for more next time on Off the Page.